Tervetuloa tähän YAPS-ohjelman Q&A, eli kysymysten ja vastausten sarjaan. Me YAPSissa ollaan syvällisesti kiinnostuneita ihmisoikeuksien toteutumisesta Lähi-idässä ja halutaan ymmärtää mahdollisimman hyvin, mitä alueella tapahtuu. Siksi me halutaan myös kuunnella ja tuoda kuulluksi sellaisia asiantuntijoita, sekä akateemisia että tavallisia ihmisiä, niin sanottuja kokemusasiantuntijoita, joiden äänet jää helposti kuulematta kansainvälisessä ihmisoikeuskeskustelussa ja myös suomalaisessa mediassa. Tänään meillä on aiheena rokotukset Israelissa ja palestiinalaisalueilla. Me ollaan luettu viime päivinä mediaraportteja Israelin onnistuneesta rokotusohjelmasta, mutta toisaalta myös kritiikkiä siitä, että se ei ole tarjonnut rokotteita palestiinalaisalueilla, Länsirannalla ja Gazassa. Nyt me halutaan kysyä perusteita Israelin toiminnalle. Ja tänään meillä on vieraana Maurice Hirsch, joka on Israelin armeijan reservin everstiluutnantti ja asianajaja, joka on muun muassa toiminut Länsirannan tuomioistuinten yleisenä syyttäjänä. Sir, welcome and thank you for giving your expertise and time for us.
Thank you for having me.
So today we have some questions on vaccination. In recent weeks, there has been a lot of talk in the Finnish media about Israel's successful vaccination program. But at the same time, however, Israel has been criticized for not vaccinating residents in the Palestinian territories. So the critics say that Israel, as an occupying power, has an obligation to provide services, including vaccinations, to populations of the occupied territory. On the other hand, Israel and the Palestinian Authority have signed other agreements under which the responsibility for health services lies with the Palestinian Authority itself. So how would you respond to this criticism? And which rules and parts of the international law should be complied with in this case, and why?
Okay, so explaining this subject really requires a little bit of background information, but I'll already start by giving the bottom line. Israel has no obligation whatsoever under international law to provide the vaccinations for the Palestinians. Now let me explain that, break that down, that subject, and explain it a little bit further. Firstly, let's talk about the idea of the Oslo Accords. What are the Oslo Accords? These are the peace agreements signed between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Authority, the PLO, which brought about the creation of the Palestinian Authority. There are numerous provisions in those accords which provide for the subjects that were transferred, entire spheres of responsibility that were transferred from the Israeli side to the Palestinian Authority. One of those spheres of responsibility transferred is the subject of health, right? The entire subject of health was transferred to the Palestinian Authority, and they have been responsible for the health of the Palestinians really since 1995. First, the Oslo Accord started in 1994 with Gaza and Jericho first. They then developed on, but really the creation of the Palestinian Authority was in 1995, and they have been responsible for the health of the Palestinians since 1995. That has continued on ever since. The pandemic that came along changed nothing. If the Palestinian Authority saw itself and was practically responsible for the health of the Palestinians a year ago and 2 years ago and 5 years ago, and the international community accepted and understood that, the basis for that, even many countries donated funds specifically to the Palestinian Authority for the purpose of healthcare, for the purpose of possibly building some type of hospitals. So if Israel is responsible for the healthcare of the Palestinians, well, why are you donating funds to the Palestinian Authority? So that's the first sphere. Health was transferred to the Palestinian Authority. Now, the Oslo Accords weren't standalone provisions. Each one didn't come, well, now you're responsible for health. They were part of a much more wider system in which not only did the Palestinians assume responsibility for certain spheres, they were also given money in order to carry out those obligations. They collect income tax from the Palestinians. They collect VAT from the Palestinians making any purchases in the Palestinian areas. Israel, as part of the Oslo Accords, also waived hundreds of millions of shekels every month in favor of the Palestinian Authority to help it meet its commitments. So really, what are you trying to say when you say that, well, now because of the pandemic, Israel is responsible? You're trying to say that A, the Oslo Accords no longer apply. There's something new that the pandemic brought along, which voided and vacated the Oslo Accords. And on the other hand, you're saying, well, but the Palestinians should continue to receive the money which Israel agreed to waive on their behalf as part of those same Oslo Accords. So that's the first argument, which shows that really the criticism has no basis whatsoever. There's an additional two arguments that need to be made. Firstly, when you're looking at the Palestinian territories, what exactly are you talking about? It's commonly referred to as the Palestinian territories as being Gaza on the one hand, Judea and Samaria, the West Bank on the other hand, and East Jerusalem. Each one of those areas is very, very individual. Let's start with Gaza. If your argument is that Israel is responsible for vaccinating Gaza as an occupier, well, so first you have to get into basics of international law. International law requires for occupation, requires the basic rule of international law for deciding whether an occupation exists or doesn't, boots on the ground. How many Israeli soldiers are there on a regular basis, a daily basis, in the Gaza Strip? The answer is none. Since September 2005, there are no Israeli soldiers in Gaza. There is no Israeli presence in Gaza. Gaza is run entirely since June 2007 by Hamas, a terrorist organization that uses the Gaza Strip to dig tunnels underneath the fences and the borders into Israel to try and kill and kidnap Israeli citizens, that fires missiles indiscriminately at Israel's civilian population. To say that Israel has any effective control in Gaza is just a lie. It's true. We have some type of a border with Gaza, and the movement of goods into Gaza via Israel is limited. Quite right. There's also a maritime blockade to prevent the Hamas from getting Iranian weapons and bringing them straight in through via the sea, which they've already tried to do. If you remember the Karina A incident in 2001, tons of weapons were sent by Iran to the PA, to the Palestinian Authority, not even yet to Hamas, to the Palestinian Authority, for the purpose of shooting them at Israel. So there's a maritime blockade. But Gaza, if you have to understand a little bit of geography, and if you don't, you should look at a map. Gaza has a border with Egypt. It doesn't control that border. Israel has no control whatsoever over that border. That is a sovereign country, Egypt, deciding what its relationship will be with the Gaza Strip. That has nothing to do with. So when you're talking about the Gaza Strip and saying that Israel has a responsibility to vaccinate the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, let me explain what you're actually arguing. You're actually arguing that the IDF, Israel, must go back into Gaza, depose the Hamas government, get rid of all the terrorists, and retake control of the daily life of the Palestinians living in Gaza. If that's your claim, that's fine. But then make that claim. If Israel is responsible, it cannot carry out its duty via a third party. It isn't sufficient to say we're giving the vaccinations to Hamas. If I am responsible, then I am responsible. I choose not to do it by a third party. So that's Gaza. East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is another a crazy situation, but different entirely. Why? Because in East Jerusalem, since 1967, since Israel took control of most of that area, Israel also immediately applied its civilian law. The people living in East Jerusalem, the wider areas of the city of Jerusalem, including the Arabs, obviously, are covered by Israeli law. Israeli law provides that there are a number of medical providers, medical service providers. You pay a minimal fee, and then you are entitled to receive your medical treatment. The Arabs of Jerusalem, that some may see as Palestinians, because it's East Jerusalem, it's occupied Jerusalem, is not considered by Israel to be occupied. The people have equal rights to the Israeli citizens, and they have been entitled to, and they have been enjoying vaccinations at the same rate as the rest of the Israeli population. These are people who can move freely around Israel.
Yeah.
And so obviously the need to vaccinate them has been very high.
Yeah.
So that's the second group of people. The third group of people is Judea and Samaria. In Judea and Samaria, you have the big Palestinian cities. They have been governed since 1995 by the Palestinian Authority. They provide medical treatment for the Palestinians who live there. And as I said in the opening statements, nothing about the pandemic changed anything in international law. It changed nothing about the Oslo Accords. It changed nothing about the obligations of Israel to provide vaccinations for the people living in the big cities. Again, also here you have to understand the criticism. It's not just that Israel is responsible for providing the vaccination. Again, if I am responsible, then I have the responsibility to give the vaccinations, not the Palestinian Authority, not via a third party. What these people are actually advocating for is that Israel should disband the Palestinian Authority, get rid of the autonomous leadership, and retake control of these areas.
Yeah.
That is not a serious argument.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but isn't it so that also in Oslo agreements, in specifically an interim agreement from 1995, there is an article which requires Israel and the Palestinian Authority to cooperate in combating infectious diseases and epidemics. So what kind of cooperation was in mind when this treaty was signed, and have the parties then acted accordingly?
So really those provisions were based on the understanding that the Palestinians and Israel live together, we work together, we generally farm together. There is a great connection between the two populations. It should be even greater were it not for the incitement and the hatred spread by the Palestinian Authority. And the understanding was that when combating different scenarios, we need to work together. So for example, in the field of agriculture, you have foot and mouth disease, where you have to work together. The transport of eggs from the Palestinian Authority, from the agricultural society there into Israel needs to be coordinated. How do you fight and avoid infectious diseases in general? So that's on the one hand, that's the cooperation that has been happening, does happen, and will continue to happen, please God, in the future.
Yeah.
Regards the pandemic itself and COVID, in the initial stages, there was also a tremendous amount of cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. At one stage, it was even commended unbelievably by the UN. The UN Secretary General's special representative in Israel, Nikolai Maladudov, specifically singled out the cooperation on the field of fighting COVID, at least in the first stages, as one of the fields of great success. That is where it's seen. The cooperation does not mean that Israel will assume responsibility for things that the PA should have done from the beginning. And even here with COVID, from the earliest stages, once the vaccine was announced, the Palestinian Authority put out a number of different notices saying, we are purchasing the vaccine. We are going to provide for the Palestinian people. We, the Palestinian Authority, are responsible for that. Unfortunately, one second. Sorry. Okay. Unfortunately, the promise of the Palestinian Authority turned out to be not so serious. They hadn't really ordered anything. They hadn't really paid for anything. And so now they were waiting like many other people around the world until there's a sufficient amount of vaccine, until they get their turn. That I don't think is specific only for the Palestinians. It's a subject which has been dealt with in Europe as well. It's a subject which is similar also for the African countries. It's no different for them, but that cooperation, just getting back to your original question, was really in the field of day-to-day responsibility and day-to-day operation. The fact that Israel is vaccinating Palestinians who have work permits to come into Israel is also part of that cooperation. We're not prepared to assume responsibility for everything, but a lot is being done. Part of that coordination, again, was allowing, for example, flights from the United Arab Emirates to land in Ben Gurion with medical supplies for the Palestinian people. Unfortunately, the Palestinian Authority chose to reject the aid that they were given because of normalization of the United Arab Emirates with Israel, and so we don't want your help. It's just an unbelievable. Two airplane loads of medical supplies for the Palestinian Authority, donated by the United Arab Emirates, were rejected by the Palestinian Authority because it was normalization with Israel.
Do you have any explanation to what was the reason that the tone changed in the beginning of January? Because until the beginning of January, the Palestinian Authority was taking the responsibility, but then suddenly there was this story which came out in media that these complaints that Israel is not providing, it's an apartheid state, it's not providing vaccinations. So there was a clear change of tone in the beginning of January. Do you have any explanation for that?
I think there are generally two explanations or three explanations. Firstly, I think all through December you saw not a small amount of so-called human rights bodies coming up with this theory, looking back at the Geneva Conventions and saying, well, according to the Geneva Conventions, Israel is responsible for everything. That's nice. That was eventually adopted by the Palestinian Authority as their real means of carrying out what they always do. Unfortunately, a pattern that we've noticed at Palestinian Media Watch. They don't take responsibility for anything, even when they are responsible. And when everything fails, they go back to their fallback, blame Israel. It's all Israel's fault. So I think was the first part of that change. The second part of the change was the tremendous success of Israel's vaccination policy. Israel, as opposed to the Palestinian Authority, decided very early on, when the vaccinations were first released, to pay an incredibly expensive amount of money for each vaccination. Our Prime Minister even took, for a little while, some criticism over that he'd paid too much, but he didn't. Said, I'm going to pay whatever we need to, and we'll get vaccinated. The money is secondary. Life comes first. The Palestinian Authority didn't decide that. They decided the opposite. They decided to, instead of using their money to purchase medical equipment and purchase the vaccines, they decided to use their money to incentivize terrorism. At the end of December, they even made an unbelievable decision to pay all of the terrorists in prison, which they pay all the year round, to pay them 3 months in advance. They could have used that money to buy vaccines for the Palestinian population. We're talking about somewhere in the region of about 50 million shekel. I don't know how to translate that into Finnish currency, but it's almost, I would say, $18,000 that they spent each for 3 months' salary just to reward terrorism. Not thousand, $18 million that they spent for 3 months of salary payments. That was their priorities. It wasn't to buy the vaccination. Their priority was to reward terrorism. The third reason, I hate to say it, but it's just out there, it's just simple anti-Semitism. Jews are responsible for everything. The Jews are responsible for, Israel is responsible for the health of the Palestinians because you're succeeding, and they're failing, so you're obviously responsible. It's just an unbelievable argument when when the Palestinian Authority has rejected aid, has not spent its own money to provide for the vaccination, but rather to pay the people who are murdering Jews, and then say, well, Israel's responsible, the Jews are responsible. That's just there is no other way to define it. It's just anti-Semitism.
By the way, out of interest, has the Palestinian Authority actually requested for humanitarian assistance from Israel?
So the answer is basically no.
Yeah.
They didn't request definitely extensive help. They requested a few weeks ago that Israel provide them with 200 batches of the vaccine so that they could vaccinate medical staff over the age of 60 who were treating patients. Israel immediately agreed on the same day that the request came in. When that became public, the Palestinian Minister of Health said, not only did we never request help, we also never received help.
Oh.
What like they couldn't even say thank you for the first 100. Since then has given them more, but to deny that they'd asked for help and to deny that they'd received help is unbelievable.
I want to read you a quote from YAPS, which was a story published yesterday, and just to hear how you comment this. It was about Israel's vaccinations, and in the end of the article, it says that a batch of a few thousand vaccines on their way to Gaza last Wednesday stuck on the Israeli side. Vaccines were to be given to Strip's care workers. The Palestinians have complained and accused Israel of violating international law. Israeli authorities say they are investigating the complaint. Zvi Hauser, chairman of Parliament Security Committee, opposes the release of vaccine doses into Gaza because, in his view, there is a danger that they will vaccinate the military leaders of Islamist Hamas.
So with Gaza and Israel's relations with Gaza, we need to understand a few additional things. We're talking about providing the vaccine as purely humanitarian aid, but when it goes through Israel. If the Palestinian Authority, they're sitting in Ramallah, they want to send vaccinations via Jordan, via Saudi Arabia, into Egypt, and then into the Gaza Strip, they can do it. It's just a question of money. It's not even a question of time. Once they get the vaccination out, they can send it very quickly through that process, but it's so much cheaper to send it through Israel. Israel has a problem with that because whilst we're talking about what these people are asking for is humanitarian assistance, this humanitarian assistance must be a two-way street, must be reciprocated. What do I mean? Hamas, the same people who are going to use those vaccinations to vaccinate themselves, because they're not using it's 1,000 vaccinations that we're talking about. They're not using the 1,000 vaccinations for the 2.5 million Palestinians on the street in Gaza. They're using for their military leadership. They are holding the bodies of 2 Israeli soldiers and 2 Israeli citizens who wandered, 2 mentally disturbed Israeli citizens who wandered inadvertently into Gaza. If we're talking about humanitarian moves, then humanitarian moves should be reciprocated. You can have your vaccine even for the military leadership. Give us back our citizens. Give us the bodies of our soldiers. If you're talking about humanitarian, that's the humanitarian equation. It's very simple. So what is more important for the Gaza and for the Hamas leadership? To get vaccinated or to hold Israeli citizens and the bodies of Israeli soldiers as bargaining chips to release terrorists? Are deciding their own priorities, not us. You have an option: choose life or choose terrorism. They're choosing terrorism every time.
Well, I have the last question about Arab citizens or Palestinian citizens in Israel, and also other ethnic and religious minorities in Israel. Are they also included in Israel's national vaccination program? And why I'm asking is this: it's because some people suggest that Israel is an apartheid state which is treating its citizens unequally depending on their ethnic or religious background. So what's your answer to that?
Firstly, I have to say that the word apartheid is so completely inappropriate for Israel. I happen to have been born in South Africa. I happen to be a refugee from South Africa after my parents fled South Africa for having illegal relationship with people of color. Ask those people who claim that Israel is an apartheid state, how many black South Africans there were in the Israeli in the South African parliament? The answer is none. How many black South Africans had the right to vote? The answer is none. In Israel, the Israeli Arab citizens and other minorities have the same rights as citizens as anyone else. It doesn't matter whether you're Jewish, whether you're Arab Muslim, Arab Christian, Druze, or just plain Christian as a minority. It doesn't matter. Once you're a citizen of Israel, you all have the same rights. And in Israel's parliament, they have representation. There are parties that represent each one of those strands. In the elections 2 years ago, the Palestinian Authority, Palestinian Media Watch followed, we identified only the voting in the Arab-only towns. There are some Arab-only towns. In those towns, 27% of the voters voted for Zionistic parties. This isn't apartheid, firstly. Secondly, when you're talking about the vaccination process goes out to everyone. Included in all of the statistics are Israel's 2 million Arab Israelis, citizens, including Christians, including Muslims, including other minorities. Israel has now started. Also, there's a large population of migrant workers / refugee seekers that came from Africa. Many of them are now also being vaccinated. The idea is to create an area which is vaccinated and to the best extent corona-free for those people here. Obviously, also that's part of the integration of the populations. Yeah. And that includes, as I said previously, the Arabs, Israelis of East Jerusalem, that the same critics would consider to be Palestinian Arabs. They've been standing in lines and getting their vaccinations exactly like every other Israeli citizen, and thank God in not small numbers. Okay,
thank you, sir. And thank you for your time and your expertise. It was really a pleasure for us.
You're really more than welcome. If you have any more questions, please feel happy to contact us at Palestinian Media Watch, and so we can help as much as we can with any questions that should arise.
Okay, thank you so much.